All right, hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, welcome to our live stream for today. It is Tuesday, April 7th. I'm just going to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer. For whatever reason, my internet connection this morning has not been that good. I just had to restart my Chromebook not that long ago. So if things are running slowly or if the sound or the video quality isn't quite as good, I apologize. Hopefully things will all come together throughout this stream. But if you can see, right now I still have a handful of tabs that are still trying to spin through and load up. So hopefully it won't be a detriment to our online class today, but just in case it is, I apologize. So let's get into our daily updates. Looking back at yesterday, we had 46 out of 51 8th grade students submit their attendance yesterday. That's great. That's like right on track with what we're normally getting. And as an update, we did have another person finalize their Genius Hour topics, so we're now up to 42 out of 51 students. So if you're one of those people who you know that your name wasn't on that table with the finalized Genius Hour topics, please make sure that you get finalized and just let me know. You know, the student who got theirs updated yesterday just sent me an email, said, hey, here's my Genius Hour question. And so now she is good to go. So let's get into talking about yesterday's journal prompt, which was our 5th track for our personal soundtrack, which is a friendship song, a song that reminded you about friendship in general or of a specific friend or group of friends. So some of the highlights from yesterday, these are from first hour. We had, and this was one that I had across multiple responses, but I'll be there for you. The Rembrandts, that's a song from Friends. The Campfire song from SpongeBob actually was not the only SpongeBob song that we had written about yesterday. We had We Love Our Friends by Sam and Colby. We had Friends by Why Don't We? And then Immortal from 21 Savage. So that was first hour. From second hour, we had Circles from Post Malone. We had Stand By Me, which all of you probably know that song. The guy who originated it was named Ben E. King. That's from like way back in the 60s. We had High Fashion by Roddy Ricch, and then Shoop from Salt and Peppa. Again, this was one that was written about yesterday in a different journal prompt, or not yesterday, I'm sorry. It was written about yesterday. It was also written about on Friday, 2 different journal prompts, but it was just kind of entertaining that the student who wrote about it as their friendship song referenced the person who had written about it as their go-to song, the one that they need to put on their soundtrack. So I just thought that was kind of a fun connection there. And then finally, we had, for third hour, we had Perfect by Ed Sheeran. There were 2 students in third hour who both wrote about this song. They wrote about each other. I thought that was a really cool connection. Just shows the strength of their friendship. We had Pop Anthology by Daniel Kim, Florida Georgia Line with Cruz, a personal favorite of mine, the Backstreet Boys with I Want It That Way, and then Hug All Your Friends. Yes, the student pointed out that was a very obvious choice for a friendship song as well. So those were just some of the journal highlights from yesterday, looking at our friendship songs. All right, so now let's jump into what we're going to be doing today, our plan. We'll go over the journal prompt for today. We'll talk about Animal Farm Chapter 1. I have a series of slides that hopefully we'll be able to go through. That seems to be one of the files that my computer is having a hard time sticking with and not having to reload. And then we'll introduce a main assignment that we're going to be doing while we're reading Animal Farm, which is our Allegory Chart. It's in Google Classroom, and I'll be making sure to talk about that as well. Then we'll transition into social studies. We'll talk about the Section 3 notes that you all filled out yesterday. There's a short quiz for today, just 2 questions again about Section 3. And then we'll talk about the protest video and response, which is your social studies assignment for today. All right, so why don't we jump right in just to try and keep everything as short as possible. Especially, like I said, I can see I'm getting, again, my bit rate is slower than is advised, so I apologize to anybody who's having video or audio issues. my internet connection is not cooperating with me today so far. So we're up to journal prompt number 61. Today, this is track 6 for your personal soundtrack, and you have a choice between two options. You can either be writing about an underrated song, so obviously that's pretty self-explanatory, a song that you think is very much underrated, one that a lot of people might not like that you do, or you're going to be writing about a guilty pleasure song. So kind of similar, but you can just go with one type of song or the other and write about that. So some things to think about would be, why is this song underrated? Why do people not like it? Why does it deserve more credit than it currently gets? A lot of these songs might be for an artist that you like. It's not necessarily their biggest hit, but it's a song that you just think is really good and one that maybe should have been out there over one of their hits. What do you like about this song? Obviously, that's something you should always be adding for these journals. And then if you're going for guilty pleasure, why is this one of your guilty pleasures? So why is this a song that people wouldn't guess that you like? Why is it one that maybe not embarrassing, but just one that people wouldn't expect you to enjoy, that you really enjoy? So you can pick either underrated or guilty pleasure, and then obviously just writing about why you've chosen this song for your soundtrack. All right, we will just have a couple more of these personal soundtrack journals, so just in case any of you are getting sick of them, don't worry. I do plan on transitioning to a different series of journals coming up here. We're not just going to do this every single time we have e-learning. All right, but that is your journal prompt for today. And so then yesterday, your assignment was, we introduced the story of Animal Farm. I previewed it a little bit. We talked about the text and the notes and everything. And you were asked to read and or listen to chapter 1. And so what we're going to do now is talk about chapter 1. Hopefully all of this is stuff that you already understand, but we're just going to introduce, what happened in the first chapter, some of the characters that were introduced, and then we'll talk about the Allegory Chart, which is, like I said, kind of a backbone assignment that we're going to be doing throughout reading this story. So like I mentioned before, if you can't tell, my connection is really moving slow here. These pages, for whatever reason, here we go. Now it looks like it's going to come up. It always seems to run slower when live streaming, which obviously makes sense. But it'll be things where even if it looks like it's fully loaded, it'll just decide to reload. So again, I apologize. I realize that this is taking longer than some of you would probably prefer. Here we go. So looks like it's coming through here. So we'll talk about chapter 1. The two main aspects of chapter 1 was really, it was an introduction to the story, and then Old Major's speech is basically the entirety of chapter 1. So we'll come here, when we talk about the different chapters in the story, we will always begin with just kind of a short summary on one slide. If you need to pause to be able to read some of this, that's totally fine. I hope that I've got it laid out where my face isn't cutting off any of this, but I will read it to you. And so just, even if you can't read it on the screen, you can listen. So in chapter 1, the animals of Manor Farm gather one night after Farmer Jones goes to sleep. They have gathered to hear a speech by Old Major, a prized white boar and respected figure among the animals. Old Major fears that he is dying and wants to give his message out before his death. Old Major talks about the misery of being an animal, how they are worked very hard with little food and then slaughtered once they are too old for work. He adds that the farm could provide far more, but that man is the root cause of all the problems. Old Major goes on to describe a dream he had where animals lived in a world without man and how wonderful it could be. Old Major urges the animals to make this rebellion happen by sticking together and avoiding the dangerous habits of humans. Major teaches the animals a song, Beasts of England, which paints a picture very similar to Major's ideal society without man. Eventually, Mr. Jones wakes up, fires his gun at the barn, thinking that a fox has caused the racket, and the animals all go to sleep for the night. All right. Just a very basic overview of chapter 1. All the animals are gathering in a barn after Farmer Jones has gone to sleep. Old Major has got a speech for them that's meant to inspire them, talk about what life could be like. Life is so hard for them, but if they could get rid of humans, that they need to incite this rebellion and work together to create life away from mankind or without mankind. So that was just a summary. Now we'll talk about some of the main characters who were introduced. So we have Mr. Jones. He's the owner of Manor Farm. He starts out the story by stumbling drunkenly to bed and ends the chapter by firing a shot randomly at the side of his barn. Now, characterization-wise, you can see that Mr. Jones, not a great farmer, obviously. He's a drinker, randomly shooting his gun off endangers his animals, and from what Old Major talks about, he clearly is not making things very good for the animals on his farm. Then we have Old Major himself. He does most of the speaking in this chapter. He is a prized white boar. He's a very respected voice among the rest of the animals. Obviously, pretty much all the other animals on the farm gather to hear his speech. He talks about how he knows that the end of his life is coming and he wants to get this message out before he dies. So he talks about this dream of an ideal society where animals could live without mankind and is trying to inspire the rest of the animals on the farm to follow his dream by eventually rebelling against humans. And then he also teaches the animals the song Beasts of England, which is one that we'll hear throughout the rest of the story. Then we also had Benjamin. Benjamin always seems to be one that people get a kick out of. He is a donkey on the farm. He's very old. He's very crabby, cynical. He's got a lot of kind of sarcastic comments, not a very pleasant person. And the only animal that he seems to feel anything good about is Boxer. So those are 3 characters we meet. Then we also meet the 3 horses that are on the farm. One of them is Boxer. He is the male workhorse. He is described as a very enormous beast. I think he's 18 hands high. He's very strong, as strong as any 2 normal horses put together. But he kind of has a stupid appearance, and he's not the most intelligent animal. So he's this worker beast, but he is not very intelligent. However, he does have great character. He's got a great heart. And overall is just a positive influence on others. Then you also have Clover. She's the female workhorse. She is a very motherly figure. She's had several foals. They've all been taken from her. And it talks about how, she's beginning to get on in middle age. She's losing her figure a little bit. But she continues to look out for all of the other animals. And especially in the chapter itself, there's a group of ducklings who have lost their mother. She protects them and is looking out for them. So Clover's kind of a motherly figure amongst the animals. And then finally, our 3rd horse we meet is Molly. She is a very foolish white mare. She's the one who would be a cart horse. She's not like a working horse. She's more of like a show horse and can move lighter things. And she is obsessed with sugar. She's obsessed with pretty things. She's all about appearance. She's all surface area. We only have a sentence or 2 about her, but moving forward, we'll learn a lot more about Molly. And then finally, just of note, Moses is the tame raven on the farm. He's Mr. Jones's pet, and he's the only animal who does not take part in this meeting. All right, so those are just some of the characters who are introduced in chapter 1, just so you can have an idea of, where they start at the beginning, what these different animals are about, so that if you weren't sure when you're reading or going forward, you'll know, what's going on with these different animals. All right, so now I am going to transition over into our allegory chart, and we'll come back to these slides because there's a bit more that I want to talk about. But the allegory chart is an assignment where last week we talked about how so much of Animal Farm is based around this literary device of allegory, where each character or each event in the book represents something from history, and specifically the history in Russia between World War I and World War II. And so we did some practice activities, read some stories from Dr. Seuss. And so now, while we're reading the story, you're going to be asked to put your expertise to use in showing how you can figure out the allegory of the different characters of Animal Farm. So you will see here that there's a word bank in terms of these are the different allegories here in this middle box that the characters could stand for. So, for example, there is going to be a character in the story who represents Joseph Stalin. There is going to be a character who represents the Russian middle class. There is going to be a character who represents the Russian secret police. And so, while we're reading, this is what you're going to be asked to fill out to figure out these different allegories. And so you'll come down here and you'll see that on the left-hand column, there's the Animal Farm character. These are all the characters from the book. So Old Major, Mr. Jones, and then there are some characters you might recognize from chapter 1, others who might not have been introduced quite yet. Your job is to fill in the Russian Revolution allegory, so the characters from this box here, the word bank, and then support means that's where you're going to connect your allegory to the character from the story. So I've given you an example, and I've told you that Old Major is an allegory for Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, which hopefully you'll remember that Karl Marx was kind of the creator of communism. He wrote the Communist Manifesto. And Vladimir Lenin was the one who led the revolutions in the Soviet Union to overthrow the Tsar, who took power. And so Old Major is kind of a combination of these two people. And so for support, I've given a quote from Old Major, which is, "What then must we do? Why work night and day, body and soul, for the overthrow of the human race?" That's what Old Major says in the story. And so I can connect that to Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin because Old Major's talking about revolting against mankind and that the human race is the cause of their problems. This is just like how Vladimir Lenin led the overthrow of the Tsar and kind of was a leader of communism in Russia. And then later on in the story, we'll find out that Old Major's ideas lead to this idea of what's called animalism. Animalism is the story's version of communism, and we talked about how Karl Marx was like the father of communism. So that is how I can connect Old Major to those figures. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. We'll talk about this as we go, but obviously if you have any questions filling this out or you have an idea of who a character represents while you're reading, shoot me an email and I can give you feedback on yes, you're on the right track, or no, you might want to make these changes. All right, but that's something we're going to be doing throughout the story. Pretty much every chapter will have one or two characters that we're going to fill in on this chart. All right, so then for today, I've also given you that Mr. Jones is an allegory for Tsar Nicholas, who was the ruler of Russia before the revolution. You know, as a human, Mr. Jones obviously overrules or controls the animals, so this could be a connection that you make. And so your assignment for today is to fill in this support box about where you're connecting Mr. Jones to Tsar Nicholas II. So in other words, how can you connect what Mr. Jones is doing in the story to what Tsar Nicholas was doing in Russia based on what you remember from that Russian Revolution Prezi sheet? So if you need to go back to that Prezi sheet for more information, you absolutely can. That would be very, very helpful. Okay, so that's your assignment for today. Fill out that box, Mr. Jones and Tsar Nicholas. How can you connect the two? And we'll come back and talk about that tomorrow. All right, but transitioning back over to these slides, I gave you this information here about Old Major. If you need a reminder, you can pause it. But then I also mentioned that Mr. Jones is an allegory for Tsar Nicholas II. And actually, this should not say Old Major. It should say Mr. Jones. So that's my fault for not changing that. So tomorrow we'll come back to these slides and we will fill in how Mr. Jones can be connected to Tsar Nicholas II. All right. So then the other thing I wanted to add about Animal Farm is each chapter I want to talk about some of the important quotes from the chapter just to give you an idea of some of the important events or the important things that are said. So one important quote, which is something that Old Major says, let's face it, our lives are miserable, laborious, and short. We are born, we are given just so much food as will keep the breath in our bodies. And those of us who are capable of it are forced to work to the last atom of our strength. In the very instant that our usefulness has come to an end, we are slaughtered with hideous cruelty. No animal in England knows the meaning of happiness or leisure after he is a year old. No animal in England is free. The life of an animal is misery and slavery. That is the plain truth. And so I just think that's an important quote. It's Old Major talking about what life is like for these animals under Mr. Jones. It's miserable. It's full of work. They're pushed to the very edge of their strength. They're not given much food. And then as soon as they're no longer useful, they're killed. So there is no freedom for animals. So think about if you can connect that back to history in any way. All right, another important quote that I have included is it not crystal clear then, comrades, that all the evils of this life of ours spring from the tyranny of human beings? Only get rid of man, and the produce of our labor would be our own. Almost overnight, we could become rich and free. What then must we do? Why work night and day, body and soul, for the overthrow of the human race? That is my message to you, comrades, rebellion. All right, I think this is an important quote because obviously it's kind of the main focus of Old Major's speech. They need to start working for rebellion against man, overthrow man, take control of their own lives. And then finally, a third important quote I thought from this chapter, again spoken by Old Major, was, and remember also that in fighting against man, we must not come to resemble him. Even when you have conquered him, do not adopt his vices. No animal must ever live in a house or sleep in a bed or wear clothes or drink alcohol or smoke tobacco or touch money or engage in trade. All the habits of man are evil. And, above all, no animal must ever tyrannize over his own kind. Weak or strong, clever or simple, we are all brothers. No animal must ever kill any other animal. All animals are equal. This, I think, is important just as a kind of hammering home. We cannot begin to look like man. We can't do the things that he does that make him evil. And we need to maintain equality, treat everyone the same, and that is what will create this better society amongst the animals. Okay? So that was it for Chapter 1 for Animal Farm. If you have any other questions, please do not hesitate to email me. I will be happy to let you know about, I'm not sure what was happening here. I'm confused about this part. But that's all I have right now for Chapter 1. And so then for language arts, again, it's just your journal prompt about either your guilty pleasure song, your underrated song, and then filling out this box here on your allegory chart connecting Mr. Jones to Tsar Nicholas. All right, so what can you take from the chapter that connects those two? All right, so that's it for language arts for now. Why don't we transition over into social studies? So I'm going to open up my notes here. I'll give everyone a second. It looks like we have a handful of viewers live with us. So if you want to open up your notes to go through these with us, I'll give you a little bit of time here. We are on part 3, which was looking at presidential actions. Okay, let me see. Nothing in the chat. That's all right. All right, so the guiding question for this section was, what role did Presidents Kennedy and Johnson play in the fight for civil rights? So we began with the election of 1960, and it was between the candidates Richard Nixon, who was a Republican, and John F. Kennedy, who was a Democrat. And as we scroll down here, the next question was who would win the election and what was a major turning point in the campaign? So John F. Kennedy would win, and he was the younger, more youthful, and confident candidate. And this was a turning point because during the first ever televised debate, Kennedy's appearance was greatly favored by people over Nixon's. Nixon had been fighting a cold. He looked sick, he looked tired, and so because this was the first debate that was broadcast on TV, not just on the radio, President Kennedy's youth, his confidence, his appearance really helped win him over. It's interesting, they talk about how during this debate, when they asked people who watched the debate, almost overwhelmingly people said that Kennedy was the winner. But when it came down to people who just listened to the debate on the radio, people actually said they thought Nixon won because they thought his ideas and his message overall was better. So just kind of an interesting little tidbit there about the power of this newfound form of media with a televised debate. So President Kennedy would win. And the next question would be, what was his standing on civil rights? And so President Kennedy, once he took office, he proposed a group of plans, a group of laws that were called the New Frontier, which was where, he wanted to help African Americans, he wanted to help minorities gain rights, but he also didn't want to anger Democrats in the South. So it was one of those where he wanted to make things better, but he didn't want to go too far to where he just alienated a large part of the country. And it's interesting because if you think back to the Civil War, we talked about how President Lincoln went through a lot of the same thing, deciding what to do in this time. So the next section we have integrating universities. Describe the drama that unfolded in the attempt to integrate the University of Mississippi. There was a student named James Meredith who wanted to enroll at the University of Mississippi, or as it's now called, Ole Miss, and he wanted to enroll as the school's first African American student. Now, the governor of Mississippi did not want James Meredith to enroll, and so at the end of the day, President Kennedy had to send federal officers in to make sure that James Meredith would be able to enroll at the university. This would lead to riots around the campus, and there would be 2 people who were killed in this drama. So going back to some of the earlier notes we talked about in terms of integrating schools, this drama would continue. I said when we talked about Brown versus Board of Education, just because the Supreme Court passed this law did not mean that all of a sudden schools and universities just began to open up to African American students freely. There was still a lot of drama and unfortunately death that came along with people trying to enroll. And then we also talked about the University of Alabama. And so African Americans were also denied admittance to the University of Alabama. So again, President Kennedy had to send in the National Guard to allow minority students to enroll. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, he was forced to back down from a promise he had made not to allow the university to integrate. And this was kind of the height of drama over integration of universities because George Wallace had been kind of the most outspoken proponent of continuing to keep universities segregated. So when he finally backed down, this was kind of the moment for Kennedy of, you know what, we're going to take some action. And so he would announce a revolutionary civil rights bill just a few days after this. Now, unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but President Kennedy was not one who would actually make it through his entire term of office because he would be assassinated at a campaign stop in Dallas. He was taking a tour of the city in an open car, and he was shot in the head and killed. And the very same day, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, who was an ex-Marine, he was arrested and he was charged with Kennedy's assassination. Now, we don't 100% know if Oswald was the one who killed Kennedy because 2 days later, when Oswald was being moved between jails, a club owner named Jack Ruby would ambush, shoot, and kill Lee Harvey Oswald. So he had not gone to trial or been convicted or anything like that before he was assassinated. And then Jack Ruby himself was arrested, and he would actually die in prison for murdering Lee Harvey Oswald. Obviously, the Kennedy assassination is the subject of a lot of different theories, conspiracy theories. I'm not going to get into any of that now. You can look that up on your own time if you would like. But it is one of the greatest unsolved crimes in the history of our country. So, unfortunately, as you would imagine, John F. Kennedy was seen as this kind of youthful voice, this youthful figure that a lot of people got behind as the president of the United States. He gets assassinated, major blow to the country, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, the vice president, would become the president after Kennedy's death. And so the next question was, what new proposals did Johnson introduce after he took office? And so Johnson would introduce a series of proposals called the Great Society, which was a series of laws and bills that had a great vision of America. And his was even more ambitious than President Kennedy's. So we talked about how Kennedy had been cautious. He didn't want to go too far in terms of what he did on the front of civil rights, didn't want to alienate too many people. And then when Lyndon Johnson takes office, he ends up going even further than Kennedy did. And so one of the first laws that Johnson signed one of the first bills that Johnson signed into law was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this act prohibited discrimination towards African Americans in terms of employment, in voting, and public facilities. So just strengthening a lot of laws that were already in place. But this was also just a way of sending a message to all people who were discriminating that you can't discriminate. And this was not only on culture or on ethnicity. This also banned discrimination based on gender, on religion. This was really a major commitment, a major statement by President Johnson and the government that discrimination was not going to be tolerated moving forward. And unfortunately, you would hope that these are things that didn't necessarily have to be passed in a law, but they did. And this is what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was all about. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which would prohibit discrimination in voting laws. And then the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and finance of property. All right. So these were additional laws that came out of that Voting Rights Act of 1965. So for what role did Presidents Kennedy and Johnson play in the fight for civil rights? Obviously, you can talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the two laws that came after it. You can talk about the visions that both had for wanting much better for America and for minority groups within America. You can talk about the integration of Ole Miss and the University of Alabama. All those different sorts of things would be ways to answer that guiding question. All right. So that is it for part 3. There is a quiz, a short 2-question quiz in Google Classroom for you to fill out. You want to talk about one of the major events in integrating American universities, and you want to be able to talk about who won the election of 1960 and what happened to him in 1963. So think about Ole Miss, think about Alabama, think about the president who won in 1960, what had happened to him, and it should be an easy 4 points. And remember, this is also your attendance for today. So just once you're ready, please make sure that you are filling this out and submitting it. And then finally, for social studies, this is your other assignment really your only assignment for today, because hopefully that quiz will take you all of 2 minutes. You are going to be writing a short response about one of the civil rights protests that we talked about last week in part 2. We talked about 3 of the early protests: the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, and sit-ins. And so I have linked a video about each of these in this assignment, and here I can zoom in a little bit just because I can see how small it looks like it's coming up on the screen. So each of these videos, I want to say they're about 4 or 5 minutes long, so none of them are too long. You just need to choose one. So choose the bus boycott, sit-ins, freedom rides. Choose one, watch the video, and then in this box here, write down which video you watched. So just say, I watched the sit-ins video, and then 2 facts that you learned from watching the video. Now, these should be new facts. These shouldn't be just things you're repeating from the outlines, because obviously you've already found that information. So just write down 2 other things that you learned from watching that video. So shouldn't take super long. Like I said, each of the videos I think is about 4 or 5 minutes. 2 things that you learned, and then you're all good for social studies for today. So in language arts, journal response, fill out the 1 box on the Allegory chart. In social studies, fill out your civil rights quiz for attendance. Watch this video in response about one of the early civil rights protests. And that's all you have for today. All right. So I'm going to come back here because I wanted to do a couple more slides. We talked yesterday about how one of the optional response on your language arts attendance form, in addition to your journal, was just asking, how was everyone's weekend? Did you do anything fun? Like I said, I think this is a good way for us to keep updated on what's going on in our lives, if anybody's doing anything fun. And so these are some of the examples of some of the activities that people wrote about, what they did with their weekend while we're in the middle of social distancing. So we had one person who, it wasn't technically the weekend, but since I saw pictures on Facebook and I thought that this was pretty entertaining, someone who went swimming or sitting on a bench out in a quote unquote lake out in the field. I thought that was pretty entertaining. We get a nice rainstorm and go out in the lake. We had a family birthday party someone went to where there were, I think, 3 family members who were celebrating birthdays together. We had 2 different students who got new puppies, which is awesome because, obviously dogs are the best. We had someone who upgraded his PC from a regular PC to a gaming PC. We had a couple students who wrote about a Titanic sleepover. I'm guessing a lot of you can figure out who that might have been. We had a student move into a new house. We had a student who talked about going 4-wheeling, going mudding. And then the most common response that I got for that is that there were just a lot of people who got to sleep in and enjoy their weekend, which is always a good thing. So that was how we spent our social distancing weekend. And then I also wanted to just throw out, these are some of the responses from Friday in terms of the things that you all had been getting into during our social distancing. So these are some of the TV shows that people were talking about getting into while we've been social distancing. We had the whole Chicago series, Fire, Med, PD. People were talking about Grey's Anatomy, Vampire Diaries, Green Arrow, NCIS, Chopped, Riverdale, Gilmore Girls. There were some other ones, but just, these are some of the TV shows that the 8th grade class is keeping up on during our social distancing time. All right, so thank you to everyone for your responses yesterday. Again, I really am proud to see how much work people are doing keeping up with all of this e-learning. I know I say it all the time. I know this is something new. It's not the most fun. It's not, exactly what we would want. But I really do appreciate all the work that people are doing while we're apart. I will be back again tomorrow with new things. Until then, I hope everyone has a happy and healthy rest of their day. Thank you again for everyone who's tuned in. If you have any questions throughout the day, please don't hesitate to email me. I'll be checking it throughout the day. But until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you all next time.